First, I'll just give you a little introduction. My name is Lars Ortegren. I'm the general manager at California Solar Electric Company in downtown Grass Valley. We've been in business for 20 years now, installing everything from little small itty-bitty off-grid systems on camper vans to bigger commercial jobs like the Briar Patch here in town. And I think one of the real unique things about working in Nevada County, especially, is that we were here not only before solar really became what it is now. We were here doing some of the first off-grid systems and kind of microgrid systems here in the state, out on the San Juan Ridge and areas that don't have traditional power. So we're pretty lucky in that we have a local skill set of people who understand both the regular on-grid systems, which are systems that don't require batteries, and systems that are meant to feed back into the grid. I think to start off, it might be good just to kind of break out those two a little bit, because I think that when you're talking about grid-tied solar systems and batteries, they're two separate pieces that are kind of solving two separate problems. When you're talking about a grid-tied solar system, you're talking about having a system that is there to really serve your financial security. You know, you're talking about having power that is cheaper than PG&E, feeding back into the grid, and basically collecting over the course of the year, you're basically collecting a bank of power that then you're paying into annually. So instead of a monthly bill, you're looking more at like an annual energy bill. For businesses, you know, and this talk is really much more about businesses than residential. You have the added piece of depreciation, which can have your return on investment can be anywhere from 2 years to 5 years typically with businesses to be able to recoup the costs of that solar system, which is a lot better than PG&E, which is just an increase every single year. Now, when you're talking about batteries, I think it starts to get a little bit more difficult when you're talking especially through the PSPS type of events, in that it's not as simple as it is just plugging in a generator or plugging into the grid. When you're talking about storing power, you're talking about storing power chemically. You know, basically turning those electrons into chemicals that then are pushing against plates of one kind or another that are then coming back into power later in the day. I think the real piece that you need to kind of wrap your head around is that when you're on the grid, you can have whatever type of lifestyle you want. You can have a infinite lifestyle electrically. Whatever the rating of your panel is, you can pull that power out up to that amount for as long as you want, and you're just going to pay more in your bill. When you're talking about these systems, they're generally much more limited in the actual max power that you can pull out of it. I mean, sure, you can buy up to that amount of that same rating of that panel, but really if you're trying to get to some kind of a reasonable price point, you need to figure out what are those loads that you're wanting to run and how long are you trying to run them, to really kind of wrap your head around what you're looking for in a PSPS type of event. And when you're talking about your business is going to be different. Every business is different for what they're actually looking at in those losses on a day-to-day. You know, like if you're talking about the Briar Patch, they lost, you know, in that first PSPS event, I think they lost somewhere around $85,000 of produce. That's a huge amount of money to be losing for one power outage. If you're talking about a small home office, you might, you know, you're going to lose that opportunity. You're going to lose that phone call that you didn't get, or your website being down that someone then is bounced off of and redirected, that then you need to be able to kind of quantify those costs first to try and figure out what is the least I need to have operating to be able to minimize that effect of a power outage. And in a house, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, what are the things that really affect you? Having a fridge full of rotten food really affects you. Not being able to have water to flush the toilet probably really affects you. But those other things probably don't matter as much. So I think that when you're talking about storage, energy storage for commercial businesses especially, you're really talking about trying to tease out what is the piece that you actually need to back up. Now, when you start getting a little further into that, the next piece that you need to look at is actually going and getting a thorough load analysis. And that doesn't mean going and looking at the breakers to count the numbers to figure out how many amps you're trying to pull. You need to actually go and either physically look at your meter to see what the kilowatts that you're pulling off of the grid when you're in a normal grid tied mode are, so if you're looking at a meter and you have your refrigerator, your lights, your well pump running, what is the amount of power that's actually being pulled out, and then take that and estimate how many hours typically you're going to want to operate. And you're basically going to be looking at two different pieces. You're going to be looking at, one, what is the maximum amount of power that you're going to be pulling at any given time, and what is the amount of storage that you're going to need in the batteries. The batteries, there's a lot of different manufacturers that are out there. There is Tesla, there is Sonnen, there's LG Chem are kind of the three main competitors, and that I would say that they're more in that kind of residential space. So those are kind of your only three options when it comes to the smaller household type of loads, and that would be more for your small office. We have a couple of different manufacturing facilities that we've included that in the solar systems that we've sold them, that is just there to power their server room, a few computers, and hopefully no one plugs in their electric heater during that time, because that will radically affect it. And then when you get into the larger scale, it really depends on, everything is completely custom. We're still, I was saying earlier when we're out eating pizza, that really right now in battery storage is kind of like the way solar was 15 years ago. All the technology's really new. A lot of the new chemistries that are being put out, the new inverters that are being put out, they haven't really been tested for that length of time that the rest of the stuff has. And so it is a little bit still of that kind of cowboy era of energy storage. And I'll kind of like jump to the end and then we'll kind of come back. But I would say, in my mind, unless you have an appetite for being a pioneer in that front, I would wait a few years. And that the upfront costs and the what you're actually getting in performance-wise out of the system is going to improve a lot probably over the next 3 or 4 years, especially if PG&E maintains doing its power shutoffs in the region, because that's a huge market that as of yet is not really served. Now I wanted to show you guys a kind of like what these systems typically do, because the idea now with these systems is that they're no longer, the idea isn't just to be a backup system. The idea is to be something that is actually working with the grid on a daily basis. this is actually one of the small offices here, and you can see kind of the consumption throughout the day. You have their loads are staying relatively small. They're around 500 watts with little peaks up to 2,000 watts throughout the day. Now, when we add the solar, and I think that this is kind of a interesting thing to think about too, because as these battery systems are coming online, these battery systems are not coming online because we in California are having PSPS problems. What these batteries are really intended for is they're solving the future problem of solar. The problem with solar is that if everyone in the neighborhood is producing this power, and you can see this big curve as the day goes on. You can tell it's also a kind of a somewhat shady spot, or maybe that's clouds. But you can see that curve of power in the middle of the day. Well, if everyone in the neighborhood is creating that same amount of power, then you run out of places for that power to go. And so then it goes from something that is a benefit to the utility to something that is really difficult for the utility. Because what happens here in the evening when everyone gets home from work is they turn on their air conditioners, they turn on their electric ovens, they turn on their TV, and all of a sudden the utility has to go from a place where it was not producing power for most of that neighborhood, and now all of a sudden they have to make massive amounts of power. So what these batteries, their primary purpose is what they'll do is they'll cover this whole evening peak time. You can tell here, this is 6 o'clock, and that's 9 o'clock to 10. But the idea is that it's covering that other amount of expensive power time so that you're not discharging to the grid, or you're not pulling from the grid, and you're not putting power back onto the grid. You're basically going off grid for that peak time, which then takes out that giant curve that the utility companies are right now paying a lot of money for. Now, so the idea of this is that this kind of buy low and sell high, because if you look at the charging of the battery, this house on this day basically didn't actually give any power back to the grid. If you look here, you have the self-consumption. It consumed 87.7% of all the power that was produced that day, and it fed in the rest to the grid. And the consumption here of that 10.57 kilowatt hours, let me put this down here a little bit here, they purchased 23%, which is kind of all this stuff over here, and all the rest of this was produced. Is that making sense? So now that sounds really great, the whole buying low and selling high. Right now, unless if you have an electric vehicle and you're on a EV rate, then one of these batteries can pay for itself in right around 8 years. And of course, the warranty on these batteries is only for 10. So that's why I kind of want to break out that, because if you're talking about solar, we're talking about solar being something that pays for itself really fast, and then you have another 20 years of the lifetime of the system that you're benefiting from that power that you're generating. When you start talking about batteries, you're talking about a whole other set of equipment, and there's not really batteries that last for 25 years. We'll get a little bit more into chemistries here in a little bit. There are some that would probably last close to 20 years. That can be, is definitely one of those things to think about. But if you're really looking at that price per, lifetime cost per kilowatt hour, you're still talking about something that's a lot more expensive than PG&E. But, like I said, if as we go forward in solar, there's a real high likelihood that over the next couple of years that there'll be the new net metering agreements will come through the California Public Utility Commission. And there's a good chance that those agreements will actually require you to have batteries with your solar. Because the utilities are going to be really hungry to try and solve this problem. They call it the duck bill. That basically it's like they have to put out very little power during the day, and then at night is this giant peak, or the hockey stick. And as we go further and further, it's either going to be they're going to need to figure out some way of limiting solar and controlling the solar, or they're going to need to figure out some way of requiring storage to be able to kind of offset their problems that they're having on the utility side. SMUD is actually one of those more forward-thinking utilities, has already been doing it for 15 years, where they have really great rates that they'll give customers that have energy storage on their property to put out, X number of kilowatt hours between this time and this time, which can help offset. But PG&E is a little behind the curve in that. So as far as the three main kind of batteries that are out there, and with us, we've installed all three. I'll kind of give you kind of the highs and lows of each one to give you a little bit of a sense. There's two main chemistries that are out there in the marketplace when it comes to a lot of these energy storage projects. There's others that I won't really mention. For a lot of off-grid projects, flooded lead acid was always the go-to chemistry. The biggest reason is it's the cheapest and the most durable for the that kind of cheap chemistry. It also requires consistent maintenance and replacing, somewhere between every 3 to 8 years. Most of the energy storage equipment of today is all under I'll call it the lithium ion umbrella. There's a lot of different chemistries that are under that lithium ion umbrella. The two main ones are the NMC, which is the nickel manganese cobalt oxide batteries, that is the battery that is running my laptop right now, the battery that is in the cell phone in your pocket. It is also the same battery that's in all the Teslas and Leafs and everything else. It is a great battery for its power density, for being lightweight and for taking up very little space. Its downsides, I don't know if anyone has looked into anything about cobalt mining, but it's one of the dirtiest mineral extraction processes you can have, and it doesn't have the best track record for the amount of cycles that it can have. If you look at the warranty on a Tesla car, it's good for about 300,000 miles, which is somewhere in that, how many cycles is that? 600 cycles or something like that is about what the warranty lasts. And I think that kind of tells you a little something about that chemistry. The Tesla Powerwall has 5,000 watts as your max power that you can have out of that, and that's including any surge. So, what surge, you ask? So you turn on your air conditioner, and when the moment that it starts up, all the lights just kind of fade a little bit when it comes on. That's because even though that air conditioner might only be on a 30 amp circuit, at the moment that you turn it on and that motor starts, it can take 130 amps for a millisecond to be able to get that motor started. It's kind of like, I always use the analogy, it's kind of like pushing a wheelbarrow full of sand. You know, like once you get it going, it's not so bad to keep it going, but getting it to start, you know, and you're out there in the garden is really difficult. And so that's really what that surge is that power to kind of get the wheel turning on those motors. 5,000 watts is great if you live in the city and you don't have a well pump and you don't have some of these more rural things that we have. You know, if you are talking about something that is like backing up a home office, it can be a great product. But the other thing that with most of these, there's no backup plan. So if your solar isn't able to recharge your batteries and your batteries get depleted, once they're dead, and they're going to wait until the grid comes back on to be able to come back to life. Some of them do have limited, they call it dark start, where it'll wait until 10 o'clock in the morning and it'll come on for 5 minutes. And if the solar doesn't kick on, then it's just going to go back off and call it quits. LG Chem, and the other, kind of the pro and the con, Tesla makes beautiful apps to go along with that are always their controls, you know, so that you're able to really simply see kind of what's happening, be able to change your backup capacity and that type of thing. But the downside is once your power goes out, guess what doesn't work? Your modem, which means you're no longer communicating with your device, so you're kind of SOL on that one. LG Chem is kind of the other main battery, you know, and both the LG Chem and the Tesla are about the same 10 kilowatt hour range. This can be paired with a Solar Edge inverter, which can save a little bit on the overall cost of the system, because you can use a piece of your solar equipment that you're already having installed to be able to power it. But the downside is though the Tesla only has 5,000, the LG Chem through the storage inverter only has about 3,800 watts. It has the same type of chemistry, and also has basically has kind of the same only app-driven controls. And then there is the Sonnen, which seems like it's not loading the page. Oh wait, there we go. Let me grab it. Now these can be more complicated machines in that they can also integrate into home automation. You always joke how it kind of looks like HAL 2000. You know, that has and especially the one that has energy automation that actually controls your appliances and that type of thing to keep your loads to where you're able to kind of back up your giant house, but it's doing it by managing all of your appliances so that things aren't turning on at the same time. This one has the lithium iron phosphate battery, somewhere between a 4,000 or an 8,000 watt internal inverter. And the batteries can be scaled at basically anywhere from 5 kilowatt hours all the way up to 20 and 2.5 kilowatt hour chunks. But it's a lot more expensive. You know, because you have about twice the cycle life of the battery. I'd say the pretty easy rule of thumb is it's about twice the price. But it also has a generator input, which is definitely something you want to think about, because when you're, if I were to go back to that curve that I was looking at before with the solar, just kind of zoom in here a little bit. So it's one thing when you're looking at solar, and when you're doing a grid-tied solar system, you're looking at matching your annual sunshine to your annual electrical usage. So this is one of the things I just love about my job too, is that we get to think about things like solstices and equinoxes all being part of what rules the system. So depending on what time of year it is, obviously, if you're talking about December or January, you notice the days are really short. So if I had a little 100-watt panel and I had it facing due south for in the middle of winter, it would produce 100 watts for about 1.8 hours a day. So I'd get, 180 watt hours that day. If I'm talking about in the middle of summer, it's closer to 8 sun hours a day. So I would be producing 700 to 800 watts. One of the great things about PG&E having doing their PSPS event so close to the equinox is that by definition, that would mean on that day, or pretty close to that day, you're pretty much producing on average the exact amount of power that you're using on the annual basis. So we're not really worried about it during that time of year. But if you're talking about a power line coming down on the road in the middle of winter, it's a totally different scenario. So my point being is that if you have that perfect size solar system where you're zeroing out your bill, you'd be producing enough power during September to be able to carry on for about a month before you start decreasing, the sunshine starts decreasing more and more and more, and your energy usage, and this is assuming your energy usage stays flat, which almost nobody's does, but you're basically kind of having diminishing returns at some point, where you're not producing that same amount of power. One of the great things about small businesses is they are actually one of the few that have really reliable amounts of power that they're pulling. There's a little bit, it seems like that, that the offices are always at 70 degrees, which means they're always dumping a huge amount of power and heating them, and dumping a huge amount of power to cool them, especially depending on who your coworkers are. And it makes it a lot easier to kind of model out a lot of these things. But I think that when you're talking about that wintertime power outage, you're talking about, really probably somewhere around half to a quarter of the power available, especially depending on the weather. So that's when storage starts to be a little bit more difficult, because when you're talking about a September power outage, you're really only talking about one night. This battery charged up to 90%, and then it would discharge down to about 50% in the night. Now this is still with the grid there, so you can imagine this would probably be quite a bit less during if we're talking about, because this is only doing this, because this is kind of just doing that time of use cycling. But if you're talking about that being a power outage, then all of this would be covered, and then the battery would be charged up in the next morning. But one thing that you can kind of tell, that if you look at the whole of this, is that this house would not, due to that 26.7%, you can tell that is not going to be covered under the system in an actual power outage situation. So, so this is where really kind of like figuring out that, you know, a lot of times like I'll use the idea of an engine and a gas tank. You know, that when you're looking at any of these solutions, you need to figure out like, one, what size and what is the smallest engine that I can put on this thing? So what is the smallest amount of power that I need to, you know, whether that's running a well, fridge, the printer, the server, what is that smallest envelope of power that the thing's not going to go into some overcurrent error and stop. And then the other piece is the figuring out how big does the gas tank need to be. So when you're talking about that gas tank, you're really looking at, you know, what is the power that happens between sunset and sunrise on a given day, and is there enough solar to be able to refill that gas tank? Then if you're, you know, and this is kind of one of these big difference between designs that we might be doing for a system like this or an off-grid design, whereas if it was an off-grid design, we'd probably say, okay, well, we need to have a battery bank that's big enough for a 3-day storm. And when you're talking about the amount of money that it takes to, you know, because basically just some rough pricing, battery capacity is about $1 a watt hour or $1,000 a kilowatt hour. It's just kind of a easy rough shot piece of it. Now that's just the batteries. You get into the inverters, that's another somewhere around $1 a watt, you know. So between the two of them, it pretty quickly grows into something that can be as expensive as the entire solar array that you have feeding into your house. Unless you can figure out a way of really decreasing your lifestyle. You know, that and this is what when we're talking about kind of resiliency in these times, I mean, you know, those of you that don't have backup generators, you probably figured out how to be pretty resilient pretty quick, you know? It's like, yeah, even with a backup generator, it's not something that, you know, it's not something you can just take for granted in the way that you did, you know. And kind of the biggest exercise is really, you know, I always say that when you're living with a battery, it's like you're having a relationship with it, and you need to figure out a way of squeezing your lifestyle down as tight as you can to make it work. And so some people's comfort boundaries are going to be like, oh yeah, I'll just live off, you know, I'll just walk around with my headlamp and just keep my refrigerator running. And other people still want to have the jacuzzi tub. So, you know, this is where it's just you really have to play with that lifestyle piece, and especially from the business perspective, it's really trying to do that cost-benefit analysis and be smart about it, because there's certain pieces that you're probably not going to want to run. You know, like I had one that I went and looked at a couple weeks ago that had a elevator that had like a 3-phase 320 amp circuit running the elevator, and I just had to tell them it's not possible for us to do that, you know, like that. At some point it just gets to be so ridiculous. But then again, it's like if you do, like I said, if you have that business and you know kind of like what is the minimum you need to keep your doors open and to not lose those opportunity costs, then that's really kind of where you want to focus looking at this and really assessing what you need to do.
I got a question.
Jump in.
So when the power outage went out, I've got a solar system, I got a backup generator.
Mm-hmm.
Frustrating thing is I wasn't able to use my solar system at all. And the truth, I could have generated plenty of power during the day to run all the refrigerators,
mm-hmm.
to run the computer, run the little bit of lights that I would have needed to work in the house off the solar system if I could have load balanced it some way or the other.
Yeah.
That was the big issue, because then the little bit that I would have needed the generator at night, I mean, I cut back to like 3 lights. Had it where I could plug in for the propane fireplace to knock off the chill in the living room, because it was starting to get a little chilly during some of those outages. And as long as I didn't run the fridge, we were in a period where it was cool enough I didn't need the AC. All I needed was a little bit of, I needed to be able to run the solar just to basically run the refrigerators, run the washing machine now and then, and a little bit during the day. And I couldn't, it was, the frustrating thing was, you know, I was probably generating 4,000 kilowatts at peak.
Right.
It's just not going anywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
it just shut off.
Just sitting there.
It's just sitting there, and yet I had to listen to a noisy generator during the day that I could have been running off my solar system if I could have load balanced it.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the big trick is that, you know, when you look at a grid-tied inverter, the way that that's intended to operate is it is just full throttle into the grid the whole time. Yeah. It's not, and that's why there's 2 different inverters in the system. You know, you have a battery inverter that's being reactive to your loads and taking that extra power and putting it into your batteries when you're not with whatever extra you're not using, and then feeding your loads at night.
You know, I got like 26 panels with inverters on each panel. I was trying to figure out how I could switch each individual panel and cut back the generation rate to match, and then only have a little bit of battery to buffer whatever I needed to buffer.
Yeah, well, I have some experimental ideas I'll talk to you about off the record, but you know, it's more like
could have gotten by. I hardly needed the.
Yeah, well, they you know, I'm not sure if you probably have a N phase system. So, I mean, I have stopped holding my breath because they've been talking about it for 4 years now. Yeah, and we had them over in our office last week, and they said, "Oh yeah, next quarter." And it's I can tell you it has been 4 years of hearing that next quarter it's going to be coming out, where basically they're talking about doing a grid autonomous inverter. So basically, you would be able to flip a switch, and it would tell the inverter, "Hey, I'm now going to be controlled by this." They have a little controller unit that's reading the power that's being pulled, and it's going to basically turn on as many inverters as you need to run your house during the day, which would be perfect. Because, you know, really all, you know, and it's like I tell people all the time, it's like really all you need to do is get your fridge cold once or twice a day, you know, and like fill up your hot water heater and have water for that day. It's not like you need to have all the rest of the stuff, you know, but yeah, so I think that could be one of those big game changers that could at least, you know, when you're talking about especially for PSPS events, really could make sense. Yeah.
Run the computers, run the modem during the day, work from the house, be able to do what I need to get done, and then generator's only got to crank a little bit at night and then turn the lights off.
Yeah.
Sleep. And minimize the amount of battery. That way you minimize the amount of battery you got to have.
Yeah.
Significantly.
So this may be a naive question,
Uh-huh.
but if you've got that full throttle power generation going on, isn't there just a way to dump the excess to heat? I don't know what.
Yeah, well, I mean, right now the simple way to do it is with batteries, because it just needs to have a
water tank with a heater in it, and you just heat hot water and boil off water. You can dump the heat, you can dump the power that
Because
way.
for load balancing, you were talking
For
about
load balancing, that's
Yeah.
another way to do it. You can just go ahead and generate and you just blow off water. So you make steam as you're just dumping. You're wasting energy, but you can.
Well, you're wasting energy that's
But you
going
can-
that you're not getting anyway.
Yeah.
But
the problem is that, you know, then a cloud comes over for, it's all assuming that solar stays constant, which, you know, even the irradiance kind of fluctuates a little bit. Yeah, but then the voltage will drop out of range to be able to.
And I've looked at some controllers that are available, but shoot, I was looking at $4,000 just for the controller to control my house.
Yeah.
Didn't make sense yet.
Yeah, but then, so I mean, just to give you an idea, like a LG Chem is going to be, somewhere in that like $13,000 installed. And that's about the same with a Tesla Powerwall, and then with the Sonans, it's like low 20s to mid 30s, depending on how big it is, So it's like all these storage systems are really expensive right now, and it's like if you already have the solar system, it's like, okay, well, if you're comparing that to a full home standby generator, full home standby generator is going to cost you somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000. That's still probably going to be, there's pieces of that are cheaper than what it would be to get the battery. But then with the battery, you also have the tax credit, and you have that a little bit of that, they call it time of use arbitrage, that buy low and sell high, that's doing. So it's making up a little bit of it. And the other piece that they don't tell you with, I'm totally against the home backup generators, because when they don't tell you is that how much fuel that those are going to burn while you're in a power outage, So you're not only talking about just I mean, here we are in Nevada County, we live in the trees, we get to hear the birds. And I don't know if anyone was outside during the PSPS, but it was just like it was like I felt like as a NASCAR race or something. You have the noise pollution, a gallon and a half of propane times 24 hours times 3 days. That's a lot of fuel that was just burned to do that. And a lot of those home standby generators, and I highly advise whoever is looking at it to shop carefully and make sure that you see what that maintenance schedule is. Because I was noticing that a lot of the most typical home backup generators that they had on sale at Home Depot that everyone was throwing in the back of their cars had a maintenance schedule of every 40 hours. 40 hours, it's like a PSPS, that's longer than 40 hours. You're gonna stop in the middle of it and change your oil and redo your spark plug? No, you're not gonna do that. So then you're probably just gonna blow up that generator. So though it's not, I still don't think it's not as cost competitive as I think it is. It could be or would be. It's also if you're comparing it to doing something like that, I'm kind of under the assumption that people are probably just going to do whatever the cheapest solution, which is probably to get a small home standby generator, plug it in, run it for a couple hours in the morning, a couple hours in the evening. That guaranteed is going to be the cheapest option, even if you have a solar, to kind of get through it. But if you're talking about, there might be things like servers or these other issues that are more applicable to small businesses, that you might need to have that equipment that's running 24 hours a day. And then if you're looking at that, like I said, that opportunity cost of what happens when that goes down, then
Buy a server in the cloud that's already got its backup generator.
You mentioned the Sonnen systems have the ability to recharge with a generator.
Uh-huh.
Is that something that you could add on to a Tesla or an LG Chem system?
No, I would say that's kind of the downside with both of those systems. And like I said, it's like that, those systems are really intended for a different market. That's that future piece that will be much more of a normal piece of people's grid-tied solar systems, that is really there to deal with the curve throughout the day. Right now the only one I know, There's custom systems that can be built, like we did one for the North San Juan Fire District, that was more, but it was more using grid-tied battery backup, a la carte inverters and batteries and that type of way to have a little bit more flexibility. And those can accept generators, but a lot of the kind of off-the-shelf solar batteries don't. Yeah, well, so, like the Sonnen, the way that these guys actually have worked is they actually have a town in Germany that they link all these together. And they actually come equipped with a firmware to where they're able to drop. I don't know how you'd ever get this passed in the US, but basically you have all the units, so your whole neighborhood, you would say it's part of this microgrid, and your batteries can both call for a charge when they're needing a charge from external sources. So when you're falling short, one of the other batteries can kick in, or if your loads are more, you can do that. We did, the first one we did was a microgrid out on the San Juan Ridge that, does anyone know Erickson Woodworking? They have like these incredible, like $20,000 rocking chairs, like a furniture maker that has stuff in the Smithsonian, but they have their wood shop out there and 5 houses, and all the 5 houses and the wood shop are all on the same grid. That's their own microgrid, where the houses can have their individual solar systems that they're using to offset the kilowatt out. So if you had a house out there and you would have a power bill, but your power bill is basically your share of the generator runtime for that amount of time. And then everyone owns the batteries together, and they figure that whole part out. And then you'd put a regular grid-tied solar system out at your house, and those kilowatt hours would be offsetting in the same way that a grid-tied solar system would, except for it's all. Yeah. Well, who knows what the future is? I think that is the biggest kind of crystal ball here. That when you're looking at the PSPS, are we looking at something that is a 3-year thing, a 5-year thing, or is it a longer term thing? It's like to what level is it going to be? And I think that's where it gets to be, a little bit of kind of the looking into the crystal ball and how that energy legislation might change, once, now that PG&E's filed for bankruptcy, how does that all play into it? There's a whole lot of stuff that's out there that's a bit of a pick your horse